Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final video of 2022, and with that, Happy New Year. As we go into 2023, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you for all the support that you guys have given me in 2022. Thank you to everyone who subscribed, everyone who liked the videos, commented, and even just watched them. It doesn't matter to me. I'm just happy that people are out there. We're creating a discussion, having fun, and watching these videos together. Thank you to the patrons who went that extra step. I really appreciate it. And yeah, just thank you for everything. This channel was able to hit 1,000 subscribers in under 6 months, which I thought was a pretty cool achievement. And it's just been going up from there. And I've been having a lot of fun with it. This is a really fun little side hobby for me. And I enjoy the discussions. I enjoy reading your guys' comments, everything. Just thank you. Thank you. And into the new year, I thought we would look at this video from Whatifalthist. That was the first video that I reacted to on this channel, which is How Canada Will Fall. I'd done some Hoi 4 videos before then with the help of some amazing editors. Thank you, you know who you are. But after I did that How Canada Will Fall video, that one really took off in a sense. And so this has been the format ever since. And with that, since we're looking at 2023, I figured why not, let's look at the civilizations of the future. So going into a new year, going into the future, every day going into the future, if you will. But let's see what Whatifalthist has to say about the next few hundred years or so in the civilizations of the future. I don't really know anything else about this video, just the title. And it's 35 minutes, but I mean, hey, you know, if it's not a long Whatifalthist video and a long reaction to it, what is it really? Thank you all again for your support in 2022. I really appreciate it. Let's make 2023 one to remember. Let's go.
The wheel of history has turned many times over. History has seen so many empires rise and fall, whether the Hittites, Egyptians, Romans, Persians, British, Mauryans, Han, Aztecs, and about 1,000 more. Civilizations come and go, leaving only genetic imprints, a few cultural traditions, and ruins for their descendants. The historian Oswald Spengler said that civilizations normally last for something like 2,500 years, and we've seen 3 separate waves of civilizations rise and fall. The first being the Bronze Age round of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus. The second being the Greeks and Romans, Persians, or Han China. Finally, Islam, the Orthodox civilizations, and the West. In many ways, the Industrial Revolution and World Wars have crashed the pre-existing cultural traditions that came into existence over thousands of years.
Aw, poor Nunavut. They belong to no one.
For most of the world, their proud thousands-of-year-old civilizations were destroyed by a combination of European colonialism and Marxism. Now their societies desperately try to figure out how to adapt to a new industrial world. Meanwhile, the proud West committed suicide during the World Wars. All at the same time, science and the massive change that came with industrial life mean that all societies have to adapt from their old ways. This video is meant to look over the next 800 or so years, going much further into the future than any other kind of video I've made to predict what new kinds of civilizations will appear around the world to replace old dying ones. We'll look at the conditions that tend to form new civilizations, and then apply those principles to the world of the future. Prepare for a strange and mind-melting journey into the distant future.
All right, 800 years. That's a tall order, my friends. That's a very tall order, but all right, I'm excited. Let's see what he has to say here.
We're going through a very crazy time in our current civilization, where I think a trained eye can start to see us evolving towards something new. But with the media presenting a more narrow view than ever before, it's hard to find all the information you need to get a full picture. Thankfully, I have ground news to help me sort things out.
Very nice. Yes, there's ground news, and then there's a couple other ones too that I've seen. I think it's like Read Across the Aisle is a pretty good app I've heard as well. And then Morning Brew too. So there you go. I was going to say, that graphic looked really good. It couldn't have been a Whatifalthist PowerPoints.
I'm going to be taking the theory for the rise and fall of civilizations from the brilliant historian Carroll Quigley. He posited that civilizations were basically cultural creations to solve the problems of a society, which included religious, social, intellectual, military, economic, or political problems. A society needs to solve all of these to a certain degree, or its negative trait would become a cancer that devours the whole society. Writing in the 60s, Carroll Quigley said that the modern West was pretty high on almost all statistics, except being fairly low in social life and impossibly low in religion. He said the West would need to have a religious revival or its entire society would fall apart.
Why does intellectual get an A+ for the 60s but a B now? Okay.
a point I've talked about in this video.
Because I don't really understand what the reason here is that with the progress that we've had in intellectual, we'd get a B now. What I'd say for 2020. Okay. I mean, the amount of scientific breakthroughs, there's more and more technological progress and everything like that, but all right, whatever. I won't hold on it. Gregarious social? Okay.
The West would need to have a religious revival or its entire society would fall apart. A point I've talked about in this video. However, his theory was also that civilizations went through patterns of various forms of behavior. His theory is that civilizations fell when they stopped having the ability to provide cultural forms to deal with the world around them as it exists in reality for them. Okay. Basically, when the cultural conditions under which that civilization formed end up being so different from the current society that a total revamp is required with a new civilization. A good example of this is how ancient Egypt formed when the area was far away from the central action of the world and distantly separated from all neighbors by the Sahara and Arabian deserts. Ancient Egypt developed into a theocratic absolutist monarchy that was incredibly good at keeping social stability inside Egypt. However, as the world changed and Egypt was suddenly in the center of the map, and Egypt was very geographically accessible for invaders, it made Egypt incredibly easy to conquer. Meanwhile, the worship of the emperor was no longer appealing when Egypt's peasants realized better and less exploitive religious systems existed elsewhere. This resulted in thousands of years of conquest by foreign powers, and under these conditions, the traditional Egyptian culture wilted. I think this is a fairly decent comparison in the modern world. I'd highly recommend reading Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, which I think is in competition to be the greatest history book of all time. And is
That's the thing. I think for 2023, I want to actually start reading some of the recommendations that he has, because then I think I could be more informed on these videos and sort of understand what he tries to say. Because that's the thing with Whatifalthist is that a lot of the times it's like it's not the points that are bad. It's just the presentation sometimes can be a little unclear and confusing. But I mean, I appreciate it nonetheless. Cool. Poor Switzerland. Doesn't exist.
About how the old traditional civilizations were crushed by the Industrial Revolution and the World Wars. Almost all certainties that had been established by the Catholic Church, Confucius, or Hinduism fell apart in front of machine guns, birth control, or new religions like communism or nationalism. None of the world's civilizations had the confidence they used to. Talk to Indian or Chinese nationalists and the massive fervor with which they react to any criticism is a sign of a profound insecurity that comes from colonialism. Islamic radicalism, which in its current form is less than 100 years old, is the same thing. Funnily enough, the West, the undisputed winner of the modern world, is the least confident of the world's civilizations and is currently attempting its own suicide. However, we humans need psychological stability.
I think I might just have to check out that video to get a better understanding of it, but like I always hear that the West is always committing suicide, but all right.
Middle Ages, they thought societies had to protect their psychic defenses in the same way they protect their physical borders from invaders, and in a lot of ways I think that's true. Without confidence in our worldview, humans either wither on the vine, like we see with so many young folks today, collapsing into watching Netflix and nihilism, having no direction to position themselves in, which is similar to the anomie seen in tribal peoples upon contact with the modern world, or horribly lashing out like the tyrannies of the industrial world like Mao, Hitler, or Stalin. Humans with psychological certainty in their worldview psychologically grow towards complete certainty. With all this going on, it seems fairly likely that we form new civilizations, so let's look at what metrics Carroll Quigley used to look for new civilizations. He said civilizations cannot form in the heartland of older civilizations, since that contains too much pre-existing cultural baggage, but often in an area under the influence of previous civilizations. It forms at the confluence of two separate, distinct societies. Meanwhile, it had to form under people of similar ethnic stock who share similar religious and cultural views. Spengler added in that they had to have a similar geography which informed their worldview. Before we start, I want to be extraordinarily humble given the timescale we're looking at. The collapse of the dominant civilizations of the modern people, those that have taken thousands of years to form, will take hundreds of years at least. This video is taking stabs in the dark to a degree that I don't even know if I'm stabbing in a room anymore. I normally say I'm betting against God and that I have infinite ways to be wrong, but that's for videos predicting the world a year from now. Here we're dealing with stuff so far in the future that I'm betting against Cthulhu. At least God can talk in human languages and has a couple best-selling books out his perspective on things. Cthulhu is just beyond us all. A very important thing to consider is that I'm missing a couple key variables that make this much more difficult. The first is technology, where we have absolutely no idea what kind of inventions could change the world over the next 1,000 years.
Yep.
Hell, we might not even be humans after a certain point. Another thing to consider is that technology radically changes what areas are geographically important. The invention of a new kind of plow around 1880 turned the American Great Plains from completely unfarmable to the most productive farmland in the world. The invention of the
Wait, how is this Arctic? What? Northern Michigan is considered Arctic? This is most of my province is considered Arctic here. So like Toronto's just down here. Okay. This is all Arctic. All right.
Malarial measures of around 1900 turned the Caribbean and Florida from an area where 60% of white arrivals would die within 6 months to a vacation paradise. Second is that the Industrial Revolution will force us to make massive philosophic breakthroughs, on the level of the famed Axial Age, which produced Jesus Christ, Confucius, Muhammad, Buddha, and the like. These figures totally dominate the trajectories of the civilizations that came after. If something like this seems far-fetched, how are figures like Nietzsche or Karl Marx noticeably different in recent history? However, with each of these figures, their philosophies were works of genius. And since I am not the greatest genius in history, I am incapable of figuring out the philosophic teachings of each future religion all over the world for the next 1,000 years, since those teachings would have to be invented in turn by some of the greatest geniuses in history.
Okay, I like where this video is going, actually, because this is just going to be a fun shot in the dark. Like, that's a lot of the times is that it gets really into the mud of sort of modern politics and looking at what's happening now and then trying to make a prediction about that in the future, which, I mean, hey, fair enough. That's the point of the videos, right? So like the one of the next American Civil War that I did, that was really about that, the borders of the 22nd century. But this one, it's like so far in the future that like you can't even say that something's wrong, because no one can predict. I mean, people have a hard enough time predicting 5 years into the future. And if you can predict 5 years into the future, start buying stocks, because then you'll be a gajillionaire, right? But because this is like so far-fetched, I think this is going to be a lot of fun, actually. So
ties my hands behind my back in a lot of ways, since trying to predict a Europe without Christianity or a China without Confucianism is very difficult. In this video, we're going to be looking at the various regions in the world and the different civilizations I think might develop going around the world and then beyond. Number 1, the Chernozem civilization. When you look at the places in the world where civilizations form, they're mostly in the wreckages of total collapses of the previous world order. The civilizations of the Iron Age, like the Jews, Indians, Persians, Phoenicians, or Greeks, came out of the rubble of the total collapse of Bronze Age civilization and their entire world system that existed for thousands of years. Alternately, how the fall of Rome allowed the creation of Islamic, Western, and Orthodox civilization. I'm very sad to say that Eastern Europe looks like it'll be in the position to have a collapse of the current civilization over the next couple centuries. That reminds me of the conditions above. Partially, this is since this area is in the middle of the map, which means it can get attacked from all sides, and thus is liable to get screwed over. I mean, this area's historian, Timothy Snyder, referred to it as the Bloodlands for a reason.
I like how Vienna got its own little map thing there.
Their history during the World Wars is just one chapter of this long and beautiful history. Another just being the conditions that this area is in. Orthodox Eastern...
Durchschnittliche jährliche Bevölkerungsentwicklung in den europäischen lokalen Gebietseinheiten. Okay, so this is like population trends. So like yearly population trends and development in local European populations. So basically this is saying that France is obviously on a population decline, and then places like Bucharest, places like Romania, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia here, they're on the up, as well as East Germany, interestingly enough. What year is this? This is 2001 to 2011. Okay. So this is already what's happened. Okay.
Eastern Europe is the area projected to lose the fastest amount of population of anywhere over the next century in the world. Every country in this area will lose half its population over the next 6 years.
Unless I translated that wrong, which I might have. So put that in the comment section if I completely translated that wrong.
But the thing to consider is that once one hits a negative cycle like that, bad begets more bad, which means that this will result in the total collapse of functioning societies in the region. Peter Zeihan, one of the most respected people in geopolitical studies today, believes that most of Afro-Eurasia is on the track to see a civilizational collapse on the level of the fall of Rome, or the Bronze Age collapse over the next century. He makes this argument due to collapsing populations and also how the modern industrial world requires American guarantorship and an extremely complex supply chain that just cannot function except under extremely optimal conditions that cannot exist forever. He makes an incredibly compelling argument, but I tend to not like apocalyptic arguments. People always say the world's ending, and it very, very, very rarely does. My own apocalyptic predictions hold that the world will suck for a few decades, and then we'll have unparalleled prosperity. But I have immense respect for Zeihan's argument, and a point must be made that we've never seen population structures like this before in history, in which half of the world's population will simply starve if anything goes wrong in the agricultural supply system. And a bet you can always take is that something will eventually go very wrong. People have predicted the end of the modern capitalist world in 15 different ways since the Industrial Revolution, and each have had compelling arguments in their own ways at the time, but each have...
And to be honest, I think nuclear war was probably the most convincing argument. The amount of times that we just sidestepped nuclear war was, too many to count, to be honest. So AI, I don't know. I'm not really one for AI. Climate change, maybe. Overpopulation. This is one argument that I just don't understand, because you have, at the same time, too many people, but then there's also a shortage of said people, right? And I understand that it has to do with demographics and that there's less working people, less young people to come and fill the positions and everything like that. But I don't know. I don't think overpopulation will be an issue. There's that one paper by the Swedish... I don't remember his position, but he's a Swede, and he says that by 2050, the world will actually see a massive labor shortage and will be dying from more people.
Have been wrong for their own complex reasons. However, whether or not you'd agree with Zeihan's thesis of total civilizational collapse, this region...
Oh, come on. There's lots of Polish Americans. There's lots of people with Romanian descent, Bulgarian, Greek. Come on. They don't care about this line. Turks will never come north of this line.
Will have a giant power vacuum.
Russia's dying.
America's geostrategic interests involve controlling the oceans and keeping Western Europe safe.
Also, I want to talk one thing about depopulation. So what I think is really interesting is that there's a lot of people from the Balkans in my program. There's a lot of people in the Balkans that I've talked to online. Join the Twitch stream, that it's basically a Balkan fest. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the times they just move from their home country, and the majority of the time they just go to Germany, right? And what I think is interesting, and that maybe like Peter Zeihan talks more about this, but it's like these places are population declining, but it's that they're not moving as far, right? And I wonder what the difference would be where during the 18th century, when you would have immigrants from Europe moving over to the Americas, which obviously you have that large amount of distance and you didn't have the same level of communications as you do now, right? What the difference is between now, say people in the Balkans and people in generally Eastern Europe-ish, right? Although Poland isn't experiencing the same amount of population decline, if I remember correctly, moving to almost bordering European countries in some sense, right? Even for people from people from Croatia, just passing by Slovenia and then going into Austria, right? For example. So I wonder if there would be any differences there.
Neither of which really involves this region. Russia seems like a totally washed out power, having totally lost its vitality and largely being washed out. Meanwhile, no Muslim power could ever dominate this region, given how big and how far north the area is. The biggest factor in making me guess that this area will form a new civilization is that there's no real ideological force here that unifies the area or provides any real power, and that Eastern Europeans really don't have that much to believe in. But Eastern Europe is some of the smartest people in the world, and they could do a wonderful job at making new ideologies. This area is incredibly ripe for some kind of new ideology or religion. The sort of trajectory...
But I mean, wouldn't nationalism be something that could possibly tie them together? Like, I would think that nationalism is still a very strong force in Eastern Europe. I don't know. Let me know what you think below.
I would guess is that Orthodox Eastern Europe over the next few centuries is the area that sees its population collapse as it already is. The sort of trajectory I could see is that Orthodox Eastern Europe over the next 2 centuries sees its population collapse as we're already seeing right now.
Yep.
And as is connected with the collapse in the global supply chains and thus urbanization now.
Germany?
And
Germany is minus 12%? No way. I have no idea. Faxmaps.com. US Census. Okay. Why would Germany minus 12%? That seems really weird. Okay.
And as is connected with the collapse in the global supply chains and thus urbanization, you'd see ruralization. The area loses a lot of its pride, and as I talk about in this video, as the Americans re-enter the European continent, it becomes a frontier area. As I talk about in these videos, I'm very bullish on the Muslim world, and so I could see this being a border region between Western, Islamic, and the remnants of Orthodox civilization. This sort of cultural intermixing is perfect for the creation of a new civilization. This area has a very long and bloody history of fighting the Muslims, and so a revived Turkish Muslim caliphate attacking the region over the centuries would ignite centuries-old traditions of
Turkish Empire
literally fighting off the Muslims. That would give this area a new purpose and meaning. I call this civilization Chernozem, or the Russian term for Black Earth, or the soil of southern Ukraine, which was populated by Slavs who drove out the native Turkic nomads in the 18th century. This is an area away from the traditional civilizational centers that would also be on a fault line of civilizational struggle. Thus, I think this civilization would be based around the Caucasus, southern Russia, Ukraine, and Romania. From there, it might spread across Eurasia and Eastern Europe. I was talking to an intelligent European friend, and what he told me was that modern Europe at this point is incapable of having a Christian revival, since it moves so far towards nihilism. For the war-torn lands of Eastern Europe, he thought that there'd be a rise of a new Nietzschean-like prophet who would be able to form a new philosophic form to unite this region. This area has always viewed the world in Manichaean black and white terms, and has always viewed the state as the exemplification of the will of the nation and whole society, likely both of which come out of how unprotected the geography is. Likewise, due to transportation problems where transporting books and ideas was much cheaper than anything with real physical economic value, Eastern Europe's aristocracies and intellectual abilities have always surpassed their actual economic abilities. Thus, Eastern Europe has often been the land of illiterate, unmotivated peasants and then brilliant and incredibly industrious upper and middle class intellectuals. A worldview like Nietzsche's, which prioritizes the creation of...
That just seems like a massive sweeping generalization, but okay. I mean, yeah, you also had years of class systems, right? Very, very heavy class systems, especially in Russia as well, right? With the peasant, serfdom not being abolished until the 1880s, if I remember correctly. Maybe I need to take my Russia history quiz again. So yeah, okay. I mean, it's the other thing too is like to have those brilliant minds. It is just a handful of people, right? And with the populations that you had in Eastern Europe, but okay, I guess he's trying to see what he's saying. The Overman. Really? That's how they translate the Übermensch? Okay.
Excellence will probably gain dominance in this region. Add on top of this being the top region where fascism is most popular in the world today. To be clear, I think the chances this region actually has Nietzsche as a prophet are fairly low, but I think in my stabbing in the dark, something like him is my best guess.
Nietzsche's not going to be
Nietzsche's also a fairly dark figure, but all of the Axial Age prophets had worldviews that are beautiful ways of viewing the world. Thus, imagine a positive ideology around attaining excellence.
Like those weirdo neo-fascist people, like they have nothing to do with Nietzsche. That's just the biggest misconception about him as an author overall.
Hopefully, the potential for which would not be bastardized with genetic engineering. Part 2. African Civilizations. Africa is the top area where I'm most curiously looking for new civilizations.
True.
Africa is an area that, to be brutally blunt, was fairly out of most of history. In the 17th century, all of Europe had around 100 million people, and India and China had about 150 million each. Meanwhile, all of sub-Saharan Africa had around 40 million. Africa had precious few developed states, mostly concentrated in the area to the south of the Sahara called the Sahel, with most of the continent illiterate before European colonization. The reason Europeans and Muslims enslaved Africans was that it was one of the few places in the world where governments weren't organized enough to be able to resist large slaving ships. This was largely due to Africa's geography, in which it first of all had the worst diseases of anywhere in the world, meaning people couldn't build cities or live in the lowlands.
Yeah, and I mean, look at the concentration, right? A lot of it's around the sub-Sahara.
There were no navigable rivers, only a handful of ports in all of sub-Saharan Africa, some of the worst soil in the world, rain patterns that made steady agriculture difficult, and no pack animals. This meant that it was incredibly difficult for African societies to scale. The incredible thing is that with the industrial age, all of Africa's geographic flaws can be solved. Railroads and canals can get around the navigation and transportation problems. The diseases can be solved with modern medicine, and fertilizer can deal with the soil problems. The effect of this has already been made self-evident through how Africa's population and agricultural productivity has gone up by a factor of 5 since 1950.
Yep.
If the population trends continue, there will be 4 billion Africans by the end of the century. However, the problem with Africa is that those trends cannot continue in a sane world. Africa's population growth has been massively...
4 billion Africans by the end of the century? Okay, I think I remember hearing something different. I heard it was something closer to 3, but...
in excess of the growth of any of its institutions. Africa lacks strong nations, transportation networks, stable capitalist systems, and the like. Africa's population growth in many ways has kept pace with its standard of living. For Zihan's thesis of a collapse in the world's order, the region that would be hit the hardest is Africa. This is for a complex set of reasons I talk about in greater depth in this video, which means that if the global economy were to crash, Africa would get hit the hardest. Most nations in Africa cannot support their own populations, and the agriculture is not irrigated or mechanized, meaning that if something goes wrong in the world, the lack of fertilizer imports means Africa will just experience mass starvation. I think it's the likely...
The other thing, too, is that it's like, this is also one of the issues, and I talked about this in the Future of Europe video. It's like, I get what he's saying, but the continent is not all the same. Right? If you even go back to this map here that he showed, right? It's that a lot of these places are food secure, right? It's not like Africa is all just one giant mechanism, right? It's 54, 52? Anyways, 52 to 54 different unique countries that have their own, sort of unique developments. And so I understand what he's saying, but I think that Africa is probably the most interesting continent, just in terms of development for the future, because it's the big question. It really is the next frontier. There's obviously a lot of very smart, very educated people in Africa. The transportation and the infrastructure is obviously coming along very well. He talked about agriculture. The main sort of big question is that will the continent, because again, if we're going in continental terms, but will some of the key countries really experience that stability, right, that allows for this sort of economic growth? For example, in Ethiopia, as far as I understand right now, right, there's still that ethnic conflict going on, which is quite a recent conflict. It only started in 2021, if I remember correctly. And so if the stability can come to the individual sort of key players in the nation, for example, Nigeria is a very stable place to be. Right, it's very, very good for investment, venture capitalisms. There's lots of investment hubs there. And so if some of these other countries can sort of come around to that point, like imagine if the Congo could see the same stability that Nigeria has, right? The opportunities there are really quite high.
Imports means Africa will just experience mass starvation.
This is going to be a long video. Uh-oh.
I think it's the likely option that most countries in Africa collapse over the next 30 years. However, as I mentioned in this video, beauty and greatness comes out of chaos, which means that Africa has the opportunity to establish civilizations that are totally new. Africa doesn't have the massive, entrenched, multi-thousand-year civilizations of places like Asia or Europe, which means there is a massive vacuum that allows the creation of new entities. Africa is also the area with the fastest population growth, thus providing a young male population to wage wars, which could further progress by creating more competition. Spengler talks about how civilizations work by first raising a population to greatness by providing them structure, but over time that structure gradually consumes a society, destroying its creativity or ability to respond to real problems. Africa has so much raw energy since it hasn't seen that process fully play out. This is why African music and pop culture are so good, since they can tap into universal human experiences with a greater degree of vigor and energy. Over the next couple centuries, we will likely see various colonial powers move into parts of Africa. This is since no African state in real...
They already are. I mean, if you look at a lot of the oil companies, especially in Angola right now, where Angola, the capital of Angola is one of the most expensive cities in the world. But it's mostly due to the amount of the sort of, what would you say, the extreme income inequality between companies like BP that have set up, what would you say, sites there, right? And as well as the expats that are funneling in there, a lot of the British, American, and whatnot. So, for example, there's a famous story of a man who, I think he bought a peach for $90 US, if I remember correctly. Peaches were selling there for $90 US. Yeah, so there's a really great article, actually. It's called Angola's Oil Boom, if I remember the title correctly. It's in the New Yorker. Highly recommend you go read that one. Super interesting article.
Real terms has the ability to resist foreign incursion. However, Africa has many minerals that are necessary to the global economy. These include Nigeria or Angola's coastal oil supply, or the Congo supply of coltan, among many others.
Yep.
However, for much of Africa, there's simply no incentive to colonize it. This means there will be a certain degree of foreign influence in Africa, while most of the...
That's the thing, is that I would see that this would just be more cooperation, less colonization. Those days are over, man. Those days are over.
...continent will be free, which seems like ideal conditions for a new civilization to form. There are a couple spots where I'd predict the rise of a new African civilization. People often talk about Pan-African civilization, but given Africa's massive size and diversity, that seems ludicrous to me. My original bet before researching was the Congo due to its shared river system, but I changed away upon realizing how unnavigable the Congo River is, alongside how poor the soil is, and the lack of any unified ethnic identity there. My strongest guess is in East Africa, where the best performing African countries today are. Tanzania and Kenya see incredible growth, and Kenya especially has developed a strong democratic and capitalist tradition that allows them to expand their influence across the whole region. If you want to go back to pre-colonial times, the Muslim merchants of the Swahili coast dominated East and Central Africa. Burundi is doing so well that most of the smartest people I know think they'll make a play to seize control of the eastern half of the DRC. They're positioned to become an African economic hub. Ethiopia, meanwhile, I'm very bullish on. It's the only country in the region with a long history, with a strong Ethiopian government going back over 2,000 years. Both Kenya and Ethiopia are by all accounts the only sub-Saharan countries that are industrializing. I see a civilization developing around the Great Rift Mountains of East Africa, which have temperate climates, some similar to Europe, alongside some of the most fertile soil on the continent, and a strong strategic dominance over both sides of the mountains. We've already seen this region gain a greater degree of unity with the proposed East African Union. The other main hub I see developing a broader civilization is Nigeria. Nigeria, in a lot of ways, is Africa's Titan. A big factor is that simply no one in Africa is capable of matching its sheer population. Nigeria is the main area with fertile soil and has easily more people than all its neighbors combined. Thus, if anything comes out of West Africa, it will come out of Nigeria. Nigeria also has the strongest enterprising hustler spirit.
Another thing to talk about too is obviously the Muslim world there in North Africa as well. Those are some interesting countries, and Algeria, Tunisia, right, Egypt as well. Those are also some interesting economic developments could happen too.
Anywhere in Africa. Nigeria has a strong capitalist economy, and Lagos being the largest port and city in Africa. You see this abroad, where Nigerian Americans are one of the most successful and best educated immigrant groups in America. Nigeria's south is the region that values education the most in all of Africa, and Igbos and Yorubas are the merchant class across the whole broader region. I don't think Nigeria itself will survive, given that it's an incredibly dysfunctional state. One which repeatedly collapses into civil wars and consistently averages the highest corruption stats of anywhere in the world. It's also split into 3 cultural regions that I have heard are as culturally distinct as Ireland from Germany inside the south, and between the north and the south as between Europe and Mongolia. Nigeria is held together with oil money to bribe the various constituent parts to stay together. This weakness means that Nigeria will not be able to survive as a unified state over the next few centuries, especially if the value of oil changes, which is exceptionally likely. However, I think the constituent parts of Nigeria after a collapse would be capable of forming their own civilizations. I think the Igbos and Yoruba in the south, with oil supplies, coastline, fertile soil, and enterprising and educated cultures, would push this. I could see this civilization spreading out from Nigeria across West Africa, hugging the coastline down to Congo and west to Liberia. Now we have a civilization in West and East Africa, but what of the third great pole of Black Africa, the South? Southern Africa has a key advantage in not having a tropical climate, thus eliminating a lot of disease, soil, and animal problems. This is where things get difficult, where geographically you'd expect something to emerge from this really vast area. However, I couldn't give you a lodestone due to the lack of clear rain or geographic patterns or regional dominance patterns. The logical center of a new development would be Cape Town, but that's not really African, but more a city of the world with large white, Asian, and non-black African populations. Cape Town will likely become an independent city-state as South Africa fails, which I talk about in this video. My guess is that Southern Africa forms its own thing, but I'd be surprised if it reaches the same dynamism of the Nigerian or East African systems. It would probably be based out of Johannesburg and the surrounding highlands, and would grow out of the relics of the former white South Africa and Cape Town. This area has immense mineral wealth, and thus I could see warlords based out of the diamond mines of Johannesburg, the copper mines of Zambia, or the cobalt mines of the Congo rise to civilization by exporting their minerals to the outside world. All these civilizations would be some form of Christian, but whenever a civilization is religious, that civilization ends up making that religion its own. In fact, what ends up happening is that if a certain civilization takes one kind of religion, the other civilization will take a new one. Thus, the Middle East made Christianity, but as Europe became Christian, the Middle East went for Islam. Or India invented Buddhism, but as the Far East became Buddhist, India reverted back to Hinduism. In Africa, we've seen Christianity develop its own very African flavor. The saying is that African Christianity is miles across and inches deep, since it so deeply meshes with local traditions. You can see something vaguely similar with Islam in Africa. The largest form of Christianity in Africa is Protestant Pentecostalism, which actually was invented in 1920s Los Angeles, and then spread to Africa as most of Africa was converted to Christianity by American missionaries. In Pentecostalism, people work themselves into frenzies where they start to foam at the mouth, talk in tongues, and rave. You can clearly see the tribal influence. However, as Africa develops as a society, expect even broader cultural divergences. Some areas will just have totally new prophets, establishing faiths with influences from both pagan and Christian sources. In other cases, we'll see Pentecostalism, but more. It kind of reminds you of the Taiping Rebellion, where in the mid-19th century, a Chinese man had a dream where he believed he was the second son of Christ, and was destined to establish a communist gender-equal utopia, thus causing the third bloodiest war in history. However, like I said in the last segment, if a religion survives, it embodies something beautiful and profound in the human spirit, and this will develop in Africa as well. Part 3. Asian Pivot. Asia has massive entrenched societies that have lasted forever. China and India have stood there for thousands of years, since there was literally no one who could remove them. Likewise, Islam is so stolid and proud today that the idea of the Muslim world ever being extinguished sounds completely insane. However, like anywhere else, the old value systems from the pre-industrial world aren't holding true, and so, like everywhere else, the civilizations of Asia will have to make large changes in order to survive. In many cases, the older cultural bedrock will be maintained, but new prophets or religions will have to rise to give Asia new purpose. The biggest spiritual void in the continent of Asia, I believe, is the Far East, with China, Korea, and Japan. This is an area where people have nothing to believe in, either falling into hentai or extreme totalitarian nationalism. Confucianism still holds true.
I don't even think he said... I think he laughed when he said that. Okay, bud. All right.
Wrong, being a social theory that cannot be disproven by science, but all the mystical beliefs that propped up Confucianism, let alone the other faiths like Buddhism or Taoism, have rotted. East Asia is also positioned to have a massive crisis over the next couple decades. For reasons I've explained in this video, this region will have a massive crisis imminently. East Asia will have its population by 2050, with some of the fastest collapsing populations of anywhere on the planet.
Hey, what?
At the same time,
hold on. China's demographic implosion. Okay.
50, with some of the fastest collapsing populations of anywhere on the planet. At the same time, it is the area most dependent upon the global economy, both for resources and for exports, and thus problems elsewhere in the global system will totally dominate this area's politics. Cultures in East Asia tend to go for totalitarianism for short-term problems, but this always blows up. We're currently seeing the communist Chinese try to go for totalitarianism, and it will blow up as China's...
I just want to say one thing, though, is that with a lot of the Whatifalthist videos, I like history. That's my thing. I really, really like history. I'm not a geopolitics guy. I'm not the, geopolitics analyst or anything. So a lot of this stuff is just kind of like, yeah, okay, maybe. But I'm actually curious more what you guys think, if you have a strong opinion on what he's saying here, specifically about China, because I find that region interesting, but it's not the focus of really what I read about in my spare time. That's mostly, Kershaw books and other things about history.
Population halves, and their population returns to rice farms to feed themselves. In the moral vacuum that comes from the collapse of modern East Asia, new religions will develop. We see this response all...
one thing is that, I would love this guy to talk to, Sam Harris or something, because it's always about new religions. And I guess really the axiom here that needs to be understood is that I think he would agree with this point, is that he would say that a civilization needs to have a religion to exist, right? Or someone like Daniel Dennett or, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or something could say that a religion does not need to exist in perhaps the form that we understand it, right? Or the non-secular or, whatever. Religion needs to exist for a society to flourish, right? And that's the sort of thing, is that there's always that sort of bent to his videos. Whatifalthist, that is, where it's like, we need to have religion. It's always about religion. Prophets need to rise and religions and everything like this. And so I wonder if as we enter this sort of phase where the world is less religious than it's ever been, particularly in Europe, as he mentioned before, right, what that really does mean for the future. And I would argue, and I would think that if you took someone who's, someone in sort of, what would you say, humanist bent, if you will, they would say that it doesn't need to exist. You don't have to have a religion, or someone who's an atheist or something like this, or agnostic, if you will, or someone that says you have to have it. That's sort of the axiom that I've understood here, and that what's the answer? No one knows, right? But again, let me know what you think below.
Ready with the rise of prophets as a response to China's humiliations by the West. This includes Hong Shu-quan of the Taiping, as I mentioned earlier, as well as Mao. I honestly have no clue what kind of new ideology and prophets will arise in East Asia. As a Westerner, it's basically impossible to predict what Oriental philosophers will invent. I was reading some texts from the modern Chinese internet right, like their equivalents to Bap and Jordan Peterson, and I was just thinking, what? Under what logic chain would you think that? Okay. Having studied them, I find Eastern philosophies like Taoism, Buddhism, or Zen brilliant, but I still need to take a couple tries to be able to figure out what they're exactly saying. The only thing I can tell you at the East's next religion is that I can't tell you anything about it. However, the Chinese's basis in Confucianism does set them up for social theory views of the world like communism. It wouldn't surprise me at all if some Chinese version of Jordan Peterson arises to explain what...
I've talked about Jordan Peterson before. Jordan Peterson is not a prophet, ladies and gentlemen. I was there at the original video at U of T, right, where the guy comes up to him with a camera and he got the mic pulled out and everything. I was there, right? I'll do a video about this one of these times. And I've been to his biblical lectures, and that he's a really great speaker, and he's a really, really great psychologist, obviously, right? He's been practicing it for decades. But as soon as he gets to the politics stuff, I don't know. I don't follow I don't really follow him as much in that sense.
Amounts to a fundamentally Confucian value system for.
But I will admit too, some of the people that I was there with, that I went to all his biblical lectures at U of T there at Osgood Hall, some people really did see him as like an actual prophet, and it was a little weird, I gotta admit.
A new era. For India, I'm going to take the brilliant theory from Amaury de Riancourt. In his wonderful book, The Eye of Shiva, he talks about how, for reasons beyond our understanding, the Hindu mystics were able to figure out the underlying nature of the world that we see with modern physics, a fundamentally irrational world where space and time are the same, where the universe is a bubble with an empty center, and non-existence is balanced with existence, among many, many other things. China is a civilization where the state went at the expense of religion, and India is the opposite. China has responded to its humiliations by the West and Japan by falling back on the state, as evidenced by communism, and India did so with religion, with Gandhi being a great example. What Amaury predicted is that a future prophet would arise from India, combining the ancient ascetic traditions with modern physics to establish a view of the world that combines modern science with traditional asceticism, where one finds meaning in the world with sublimation into the universe. Amaury also said that India has always tried to elevate the individual at the expense of the collective religiously. Both Hinduism and Buddhism are about the individual escaping the travails of the world. Amaury de Riancourt predicted in the 60s that the Indians would be the society most willing to use genetic engineering in the future, since it was the natural progression of that chain of logic, and a society with such an established precedent of inequality that came from the caste system, with the Brahmins already being viewed as a higher form of being that would elevate themselves towards the gods. The Muslim world's more complicated. Islam today appears to be the religion that's done the best job of maintaining its social influence over its societies. Partially for this reason, as I've mentioned before in this video, and for a couple other reasons, I'm bullish on Islam over the next couple centuries, since they're one of the very few cultures in the world that are still willing to die over something and have growing populations. However, Islam will still eventually face the same religious decay as the other main world religions, given that they have to deal with the same effects of industrialization. It's my belief that this region will suffer massive pain over the next few centuries, and then form a new caliphate that will be a superpower. I don't really know, but I guess Islam will respond to this in the same way the Semitic peoples have responded to previous changes, by having a prophet arise to update but still reaffirm Yahweh's message. The brilliant historian Fabri has made a model of showing the cycles of Semitic societies, and believes that Islam will have a new prophet over the next few centuries. I don't know if this will result in strengthening Islam, since they'd be operating inside the Muslim tradition, or if this figure will form some new Abrahamic religion like Christianity or Judaism. Part 4. The English-speaking world.
Sure.
Finally, I think the English-speaking world will split off as its own civilization from the rest of the West. We can already see this in how America differs from Europe, both of which had incredibly different approaches to the post-war world. Europe largely abandoned all the principles that had built its success over the previous 1,000 years, whether capitalism, Christianity, or the nation, while the United States kept them. This makes it sound like America is the true successor to Western civilization, which I don't think is the best way to view this situation. America is England's descendant state, and England was already pretty strange by European standards, but America took all of England's quirks like hardo capitalism, openness, religion and intellectual tolerance, individualism, and a couple other things, while removing the European constants like long histories, clear hierarchical structures, and the like, thus producing something that's become progressively less European over time. In the book History is Begun by Bruno Massais, he makes a very interesting argument that America and Europe are becoming different civilizations, which I agree with. Partially this is for the reasons above, but also America is becoming a very different society from Europe. America is now only 60% non-Hispanic white, meaning that keeping an identity as being a predominantly Western European society doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Likewise, most Americans are in such a different climate from Europe, whether being on the Pacific, in the subtropics, or in the desert and plains, that identifying with Europe's temperate woodland climate's difficult. Most Americans don't identify as Westerners, instead as Americans, an identity that includes many people of color and is based upon the near spiritual document of the Constitution and freedom, rather than...
But I mean, again, I would say the Europeans do the same thing, right? They identify within their nation, and so obviously that's the point of nationalism that came about in the 19th century, right? That sort of wave of European nationalism, which eventually exploded in near the end of the Great War, right? And then really took its shape in the post-war years from there. So I don't really see what his point is exactly, because I mean, Canadians fall into this interesting sort of position as well, where again we're just like with the USA, our ties, our roots are obviously in England and through the British monarchy, but we've become much more like unique Americans in that sense than we are more European.
Than European cathedrals and kings. Over the next few centuries, I think the English-speaking world, which is culturally attached to the United States, whether or not they like to admit it, will form a new civilization attached to this new American civilization that will go in a very different direction than continental Europe.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's like the difference between in Australia and New Zealand, I think that they fall completely differently. I would think that it would be more of an Americas, right? So you could maybe see a union of the Americas, right, between North America. I shouldn't say the Americas because that would include South America, but Canada, the United States, and maybe even Mexico to a point. And again, this wouldn't happen for decades and decades. We will all be very dead by the time this maybe happens. But I could see something like that, or maybe sort of like, as it says here, like an EU style type of thing between the North American countries.
Population competitivity, Europe is projected to continue its decline as a percentage of the world's economy that it's already seen since the Second World War.
I already talked about
America's projected to see stable or growing percentages of the world's economy, which will lessen America's interest in Europe. Going forward over the next 500 or so years, I see Northern Europe will probably be integrated into a future American civilization, especially
What?
Scandinavia, but Southern Europe seems less likely. I think this division from Europe will be furthered by the integration of Latin societies into the American system.
Yeah.
Mexico is now thoroughly glued into the American economy, and Peter Zeihan makes a wonderful argument that this will continue in the future due to complementary demographic, geographic, and economic structures.
Yep.
The vast number of Hispanic Americans will ease this partnership between the Anglo and the Latin worlds. I'd put Cuba.
And I mean, honestly, for the better. The more ties that we can get in North America, right, and the closer we can get to our Mexican brother and sisters, the better. Because, you know, as again, I'm not the geopolitics guy, but as you have obviously the issues in China, the more that you can base manufacturing and other sorts of things around North America, the better.
Cuba in the same category, where once the communist government falls, Cuban Americans likely industrialize the island and drag it into the American sphere of influence. However, as American society becomes more Latin, its connections to Europe will also grow weaker. This Anglo civilization will be incredibly dynamic and creative.
Again, I would think that it would just be America's,
but
but
will
hey,
have
fair
the
enough.
disadvantages of being one of the few areas in the world least touched by the coming world crisis, and being split away from the main conflict areas around the world, giving its people the opportunity to grow arrogant, soft, and complacent. Being largely an island coalition in many ways, the Anglos will likely dominate the world's oceans and be air dominant for centuries to come. Likewise, the problem with American society so far is that it's so open it can enforce social standards well, thus resulting in bad movies, homeless people shooting heroin in the streets, or lack of unifying myths and strength.
Okay.
Of anyone in the world, the Anglos have by far the highest chance of colonizing space. America is the most capital of anywhere in the world, the best space technology, a frontier spirit that demands continual expansion, and a protected geography that allows them strategic security. Americans show far more excitement about colonizing space than anyone else in the world, since it combines their love of gadgets and the frontier. I think the most likely option is the Anglos totally dominate the colonization of space for the next couple centuries, since I just can't think of a single power that could come close to compete. If space becomes the dominant strategic concern over the future, and we see improvements in agriculture that allow new regions to be brought into cultivation, as we've consistently seen over the last few centuries, I can see two regions gaining immense traction in the Anglo world. The first being Alaska, which is so close to the North Pole, would have a massive air edge, and its isolated geography gives it strategic protection to colonize space. I'd put Australia and New Zealand in the exact same category as well for their isolation and size. The process of man's colonization of the stars will probably take centuries or probably millennia, thus allowing many different players to have different golden ages and different colonial periods. However, I'd say that the Americans and Anglos have an incredible first starter advantage, which allows them to populate Mars, Venus, the moon, and maybe some of Jupiter's moons over the next 200 years. This brings up an even more fascinating question of what new civilization
I think that was a photo of a halo. This looked like a halo ring.
Will dominate as mankind pushes beyond this planet, maybe even beyond the stars, perhaps in some bizarre future world into different dimensions. Think of how different China is from Western Europe, and remember, they're still on the same megacontinent. Now imagine if a civilization developing on Venus, or on some 300-year voyage to some far star, would develop under those conditions. Now that's a fascinating question that I'd love to see how the future will play out. Whatifalthist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment,
Cool. Why not? Why not? Why not? All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one. Very, very long, 52 minutes. But I mean, hey, what else is new? I just want to say thank you all again very much for everything in 2022. 2023, I'm looking forward to it. I've got a couple plans as well for videos that are going to be coming out. And thank you all again. Let me know what you think. Where are we going as we head into 2023? Let me know what you're going to be up to for the new year, and where will we be heading as a civilization? What did you think about the video and everything like that? Thank you all again. Take care. Happy New Year, and I'll see you guys next year.